Hello, I'm Robert Hicks. As you see from my very long title here, I'm associated with the College of Physicians of Philadelphia. I was the director of the Mütter Museum and Historical Medical Library for over 11 years until recently when I changed my status to this. So now I'm spending my time more on the history stuff than the day-to-day museum management stuff. Now, why am I talking about this topic? About 5 years ago, we conceived the idea of creating a significant long-term exhibition on the flu pandemic in Philadelphia. A few reasons for this, one being the World War I anniversary was coming up, and we were not in a position to do World War I, but the pandemic kept nagging at me because I knew its basic outline, but I didn't know how it played in Philadelphia. And the more I spent time looking into that, the more grotesque the situation got, and it became absolutely certain that we should look at this for a major long-term exhibition. Now, on the image you see on the screen, there are three inset images: the Spit Spreads death sign, which you'll see again, this patriotic banner, and also the image of the nurse. I want to call your attention to two things. The nurse has on her dark collar a small button that's poking in through her white smock, and I will return to that later on the presentation. But this patriotic banner is important because it's difficult to talk about the 1918 flu in Philly, or anywhere else for that matter, without talking about the larger world picture. And in the United States, patriotism is in everybody's mind because World War I. Now, I probably do not need to introduce the museum, but just in case, the College of Physicians of Philadelphia is the larger institution of which the Mütter Museum is a part. And the college does bear this moniker proudly, the birthplace of American medicine, a trademarked label. Why do we claim that? It's because in 1787, the college was created, and the physicians who created this college meant it as a fraternal professional organization to improve the standards of medical work. It was not a teaching institution. And some of those fellows included people instrumental in founding the United States. Well, those physicians were also those who pioneered institutions which continue to influence us today, because Philadelphia was the city of medical firsts. First hospital specializing in children, first medical school. The list goes on. And when we open again, we do hope you come to the Mütter Museum, particularly to see our influenza exhibit, and I'll have more to say about that shortly. But I want to begin with a moment in the middle of October 1918. At this moment, Philadelphia is experiencing a dire epidemic. People were not calling it a pandemic yet. And just remember that the difference between a pandemic and an epidemic is that a pandemic is a really, really big epidemic. In other words, global, just as we are experiencing now with the coronavirus. At this moment in mid-October, many people were dying very quickly in Philadelphia, and schools, colleges are closing. Now at St. Joseph College, they have a seminary, and they have canceled the classes. They've gathered the seminary students together, and they said, look, we are in a dire situation here, and we need to get you out and volunteering to assist people and help save lives and bring the city back into order. So the seminary students were put in pairs, and each pair of students was given a cart and a horse. Dr. Frank Bieberstein, not a doctor at the time, a seminary student, was one of those students. And he recalled later that the job of he and his partner was to walk up and down suburban streets and collect the dead. They were to call out for the dead, collect the dead from houses or on sidewalks, place them in the cart, and take them away. I stress that this is 1918, not medieval Europe with the bubonic plague. This is 1918 in a modern industrial American city. We've got airplanes, we've got radio, we've got cars. Population of the country is over 100 million now. This is a country on the move and a city on the move. So how did we get to this spot? This is a photograph from the Catholic Archdiocese of Philadelphia that shows seminary students and other volunteer students digging mass graves. So how did we get to this? 1918, World War I is going on. In the United States, all attention is now focused on the war effort. We've been a relative latecomer to it. In Congress, the Senate's about to take on a bill to extend the right to vote to women. So that is the era we're talking about. Now, World War I started in 1914 for Europe. The United States didn't enter the war until 1917, And here in the summer to fall of 1918, the American forces are about to participate in the largest offensive of the war involving Americans. We have about 1.5 million soldiers in France at this moment. France and Belgium, very specifically, have been pretty much laid waste by this war that's been going on for years and has already consumed many millions of lives. Remember the patriotic posters. If, before the epidemic hit in this country, you had attended a public activity, it could be a concert, it could be a lecture, theater performance. Before the activity could go on, you would first have to hear from what was called a 4-minute man. 4-minute men were sent around the country to give short patriotic speeches, not to exceed 4 minutes, to get you to buy bonds to support the war effort. And to keep you in the mood for this period, I'm going to read you an actual 4-minute man speech, abbreviated. Ladies and gentlemen, I have just received the information that there is a German spy among us, a German spy watching us. He's around here somewhere reporting upon you and me and sending reports about us to Berlin and telling the Germans just what we are doing with the Liberty Loan. From every section of the country, these spies have been getting reports over to Berlin, and not general ones, but with details, where the loan is going well, where its success seems weak, and what the people are saying. For the German government is worried about our great loan. They fear its effect upon the German morale, and they're raising a loan this month too. If the American people lend their billions now, one and all, with a hip hip hurrah, it means that America is united and strong. While if we lend our money half-heartedly, America seems weak and autocracy remains strong. Money means everything now. Americans can have but one opinion, only one wish in the Liberty Loan. Well, I hope those spies are getting their messages straight and letting Berlin know that America is hurling back these answers. For treachery everywhere, $1 billion. For murder of American women and children, $1 billion more. In the world fight for liberty, our share, billions and billions and endless billions. Do not let the German spy hear and report that you are a slacker. Now, I gave that speech not just for a bit of atmosphere, but to make a point that just as diseases can shape human populations, human behavior, human culture can also shape the contours of disease. At the time, the patriotic fervor of this country was at a fever pitch, and the pursuit of the patriotic goal, which was to win the war in France, dominated everything, and certainly had an effect on how the flu happened in this country, how it spread, and how things ultimately came to a conclusion. If you want to reflect on today, the political world is not necessarily in agreement with the scientific world, and that relationship keeps changing day by day. Philadelphia at this time has a population of getting on to 2 million people. 300,000 people swell this population figure up to about 2 million, and those extra people are war workers. This is a major industrial city with the largest shipyard in the world, with a huge Navy presence. And most of those incoming workers are immigrants who have come here to take advantage of short-term work that's well paid in industry. Now, this is not a good time for disease to erupt because about 75%, as you see here, of the medical staff just of this one hospital was overseas in France. Citywide, that's about 30% of all available doctors, and upwards of 50% of all available nurses are in France. So we are understaffed medically to take on something as big as a pandemic. Now, late summer, June to July, we know that Spanish flu is out there. It's not just happening in Spain, it's happening throughout Europe, and cases are beginning to percolate throughout the United States. There's nothing Spanish about it. It was tagged Spanish flu because some of the earlier reports of this flu epidemic, as it was at the time, seemed to happen in Spain, and Spain was not exercising the press censorship that other countries, including the United States, were exercising. The censorship would have been in place because no one wanted anything to detract from the necessity to prosecute the war. It's difficult to pinpoint where flu cases first started, and I think it's kind of a fruitless historical quest to do so. One of the earliest American cities to show it was Boston. We also know it was showing up very early in training camps of US soldiers who were being trained, sent by ship to Europe. And some of those regiments on ship arrived quite sick and had to be quarantined when they got on the other end. Soldiers in the battlefields on all sides are also getting the flu. Also, there appear to be multiple waves of it. Now, looking at Philadelphia for a moment, the city of Exeter was a British merchant ship that came here in June. It arrived with flu cases. Now, the city's public health director at the time, we'll meet him in a moment, Dr. Cruzen, arranged to have this ship berthed someplace in isolation where the sick sailors could be removed, and they were taken to a hospital in a quarantined area. And they were treated, returned to the ship, and they went back to business. But this was a British ship, and its crew, like crews on merchant ships today, are from all over the world. A number of them were Lascars, which were Hindu sailors. So we had people from a very distant part of the planet on that ship also bringing flu. And it illustrates then as now the difficulty of keeping any kind of a disease within any national boundaries. Now, people had seen the flu before. They knew what its symptoms were. We hadn't had previously an outbreak in this country that turned out to be as devastating as 19, but an old child skip rope rhyme comes back into play again. I had a little bird and its name was Enza. I opened up the window and in flew Enza. Now, this word has been in the language for almost 5 centuries, and it seemed to be coined in Italy, which underwent some pretty severe influenza outbreaks. And the word speaks to a nebulous but a bit mystical origin. It's astrological. It means the disaster coming from the stars, the influence from the stars, and it's the same root, of course, as the word influence. Now, here's the public health director, Dr. Wilmer Cruzen. Now, if you've heard me speak on this topic before, I probably was a lot more critical of Dr. Cruzen than I probably will be today, because I keep learning about this event as I go along, and all of my presentations differ as it continues to evolve. And I'm going to give him some high marks as well as some criticisms. But his attention at the moment is focused on the 4th Naval District, which includes the shipyard. In Boston, a number of soldiers at military training up there and sailors had gotten the flu, and about 300 of those sailors, not necessarily the sick ones, but for military purposes, were transferred down to Philadelphia. Some of them undoubtedly had the flu, and within the 4th Naval District here in Philly, the flu cases started to erupt. Now, if you were Dr. Cruzen, you're keeping track of 2 things, mortality versus morbidity. And morbidity is simply people getting sick, the number of people getting sick. And of course, mortality is how many people were dying. But well into September, where Cruzen and others are monitoring flu cases, it didn't look like Philadelphia was experiencing a big problem outside of the Naval District itself, which had hundreds of cases. The daily mortality was about 10 people a day, which, taken in context with normal deaths in a city like this, of the size and diversity, was not particularly unusual. And the mortality was just not very high. And even into mid-September, it was beginning to look as if new flu cases were beginning to taper off a bit. But it starts to go up and down. Now, Cruzen decides to make the flu a reportable disease on this date, September 21st. There have been cases in the civilian population. Cruzen is certainly aware that a possibility of a major outbreak in Philadelphia is possible. To the public, he's still saying, we're probably not going to get a big epidemic here, but take precautions. Precautions meaning what we call now social distancing. At the time, it was don't go to big events if you don't have to, particularly if you're feeling ill, you should stay home and have available a place to sleep, a way to clean yourself, have food and water. But there is a parade upcoming that's going to be very important in the fundraising. And remember the patriotic piece of this. So Cruzen is following the data. He's making it a reportable disease. He's in touch with the Navy. The Navy is experiencing a big problem. We're not doing anything, though, to say marshal big supplies and set them aside in anticipation of a big outbreak, because Cruzen does not think it's going to happen. But that begins to change very quickly. On September 28th, this is the big parade, Liberty Loan Parade, which was the fundraising parade for Philadelphia. It turned out to be the largest parade in Philadelphia's history up to that moment. About 200,000 people lined the sidewalks. As you can see from the big photograph, this was largely a rah-rah military parade. Local soldiers, sailors marched in this, display of military hardware, and people were asked to take advantage of the fever of the moment, open those wallets and start giving. If you bought war bonds, you were given one of these pins, as you see in the upper right, a 4th Liberty Loan pin called an honor pin. Remember that 4-minute man speech, don't be a slacker. The two worst things you could call somebody in 1918 were slacker, that is, a person who wasn't doing their bit to support the war effort, or a hoarder, the people who, as we might say today, bought up all the toilet paper and peanut butter and didn't leave any for anybody else, people who were hoarding supplies. Now you see these two newspapers, the Inquirer pages. The lower one shows at the far right of the photographs in that paper, a man at the top hat wearing a black suit. That's the Chicago Liberty Loan Parade, the day before Philadelphia held its. And that fellow is President Woodrow Wilson. He marched in that parade. Now, the public health director was also worried in Chicago about the outbreak of the flu and the fact that large numbers of people would be gathering. And he issued health advice that, all right, if you have to come out to this parade, so be it. But after you're done, you should go home, take your clothes off, wash yourself down, make sure you're not sweating, clean yourself, dry yourself, and take to bed and take a laxative. And that's your best preventive measure to avoid the flu. The idea of hand washing, for example, was not part of the public message. Now, what was Dr. Cruzen doing on September 28th? He was not there at that parade, but he was starting to get very worried, and he was out setting up the first emergency temporary hospital with 400 beds. Things began to erupt very quickly after the parade. Now, on September 30th, just 2 days later, Cruzen is saying, we now officially have an epidemic in the city. And the mayor hands him emergency funds to the tune of $100,000, which is a lot in 1918 money. Cruzen continues to open up other emergency hospitals at various locations. But within 72 hours after the parade, every hospital bed in the city is filled. And you see the shaming thing going on with the poster at the top. You'll be uncomfortable if you don't have your honor button on. The man in the greenish suit with his face turned down with his arms crossed does not have an honor button, and every other person on that trolley has a smiley, healthy face. None of them have the flu, but they all have their honor buttons. So public shaming was going on. So even with flu cases happening, the focus is still war effort and raising money for the war loan. This is what quickly happens, and this is what nobody anticipates. All of a sudden, mortality skyrockets in that first week of October. You can see these statistics, 700 dead by third week, 4,500 dead. And this third week in October, the largest death week in US history for disease, 21,000 people. Now, again, we've still got this patriotic imagery all around you, everything on the war effort, buy bonds. You're being given a lot of scare propaganda at the same time people were dying. Notice the poster showing the Hun taking one of our women, or in this case, a young Belgian girl, and who knows what was going to happen, although everybody can guess. But all these posters always show the Germans as sort of stoop-shouldered, very big feet, small heads, brutish looking, and they've got something bloody in their hands, in this case, a dagger or a bayonet. Now, if people were fearful about the flu, they turn around, they're also fearful about the Germans. And just as today we've seen hostility to a lot of Asian Americans, blaming them for coronavirus, the person you blamed in 1918 was anyone of German ancestry. And there were lynchings that took place in this country of Germans living in the United States. And in Philadelphia, there was a traveling salesman who came to town, didn't even have a German surname, booked into a hotel. People thought he was suspiciously German. The police went out to interview him, decided he wasn't a threat, but this man was found the next morning with his throat cut. Now, the picture of the lamppost is significant. When the Liberty Loan Parade was going on, there was patriotic imagery everywhere, patriotic banners on the lampposts. But there was no time to take those down before public health posters had to be put up with very stark messages. And that's where the spit spreads death comes from. People spitting in public. At the time, even without a precise knowledge of what the flu virus was, people knew spit carried some kind of germs. Whether spit got on you, got on your clothes, people were not supposed to spit on sidewalks. People were, of course, men are chewing a lot of tobacco and spitting anyway. So this is a real legitimate worry. So this picture attests to how quickly there was a turnaround from the parade, the patriotic rah-rah, to now we got a really big health disaster on our hands. Here's an example of a makeshift hospital. Newspapers started to record this. It has been said in criticism of Cruzen by some authors that doctors had come forward and wanted this parade stopped. They wanted to get something in the newspaper to run some kind of an ad to suggest that maybe people shouldn't turn out for this. But remember the patriotic fervor of the moment. First of all, Cruzen didn't have the authority to stop the parade, only the mayor did, so he could only recommend. Secondly, there really is no evidence that physicians were coming forth and saying, don't do this. There's one on record. Also, the paper did run a public health advisory, but it was into the first 10 days of October rather than on September 28th. There really wasn't anything Dr. Cruzen could have done to stop that parade. This was a patriotic banner for the city, and to not do it would have been the only American city not to have had a parade. So things are starting to close, just as we have seen in our own present predicament. Now, I have highlighted in orange or yellow this quotation: any person with two hands and a willingness to work. You see another one of these photographs of volunteers digging a mass grave, and there are multiple mass graves that were dug in Philadelphia. City morgue only had space for about 36 bodies. So as you saw from those mortality statistics, this quickly was surpassed. People would take bodies down the city morgue, just leave them there. People began burying their own dead because there was no way to have bodies removed and buried unless Frank Bieberstein happened to be in your neighborhood to pick up a body. So people were burying their own. Sometimes people would take bodies to cemeteries and just leave them there. Relatively fewer funeral services were taking place. Of course, you couldn't have one indoors because that would violate the closure order. So people are experiencing a very abnormal social situation, just as we are now in a lot of respects. But I highlighted the part in yellow because it speaks to Philadelphia's history with disease. Philadelphia had another epidemic that killed about 10% of its city population, and that was yellow fever in 1793. The mayor at that time was worried because the relatively few city workers available were sick or they were too afraid to come in. At that moment in 1793, Philadelphia was the capital city of the young United States. Members of Congress got out of town. If you were rich and had the means to do it, you got out of town. And Congress did not even think it had the legal authority to convene anywhere outside of Philadelphia. So during the yellow fever epidemic, which hit not only Philly, but other places, the government didn't sit. So the mayor put an ad in the paper: look, any person that can help out, show up. I'll give you a job for the day. That's 1793. The exact same thing is being replayed here in 1918. So as I say here, infrastructure failure is becoming quite evident. The police really do have a blue flu. Hundreds of police are now sick and not available for duty, especially when they're really needed to help do flu-related tasks, as Cruzen is arranging for them to do. Also, telephones require switchboards. That means people, mostly women, at the switchboards. Well, they're getting sick. So the word is going out, don't make a phone call unless it's emergency. I mentioned immigrants and I mentioned the anti-German bias. It went so far as Bayer aspirin, which is a relatively new commodity at the time. Well, it's a German-owned firm manufacturing aspirin. Department of Agriculture for the country had to look into this and certify the American public. The Germans are not using aspirin to implant flu virus, so don't worry about it, you can use it. That was the extent of the public fear. But also people were resorting to desperation here. Remember, doctors and nurses still make house calls at this time. And since doctors and nurses are in low supply, when they do make house calls, people tend to swarm around them. And one nurse went out in her nurse uniform, made a call, and people swarmed her, offering even up to $100 bribes if the nurse would come to their house next. One physician got in the newspaper for making a house call to deal with the flu, and when he came out, he was besieged by people saying, "You're not leaving this neighborhood until you come to my house." And that physician did not leave the neighborhood until he had visited 57 households. But let's talk about the disease itself. Now, as I said, there could have been people at the Liberty Loan Parade who already had the flu. There's an incubation period, so if you get it, and most cases were fairly mild but debilitating, there could be a recovery in about 10 days. So the whole cycle could run about 2 weeks. You may not manifest symptoms right away, but if you did, these were familiar flu symptoms. And we tend today to merge the flu with symptoms of a real bad cold, the aches and pains, coughs. But the flu cases can be more severe. And also in the extreme flu cases, particularly those where their lives are threatened, you see what happens to this man, the cyanosis. He's turning blue because he's suffocating. He's suffocating because of how the virus works. It gets into the lungs, hacks into cells, hacks into the alveoli, which transfer your oxygen from breathing into the bloodstream and oxygenate the blood. It's hacking into those cells and hacking through them and into other cells. And so as cells reproduce, they're reproducing with the disease. But the cells themselves are degrading, and effectively your lungs are coming apart and filling up with a frothy, bloody mix, and you cannot breathe. So the suffocation and eventual death is pretty severe, and it's pretty painful. But people getting close to those symptoms can experience a loss of sight, smell. They can be disoriented. They can have hallucinations. They start bleeding from places they're not supposed to bleed, like their eyes, for example. But people were so worried about encountering people who had the flu or people with the flu showing up in workplaces, because workplaces were not closed, I must stress. People still had to go to work. There was no getting paid if you didn't. There was no unemployment insurance. So sick people had to force themselves to go to work or they could not feed their families. Well, people with the flu were described by people who didn't have the flu as having a very peculiar odor about them, the odor of musty straw. But those people in those severe cases where their lungs are actually coming apart, those alveoli are being cracked open, those people, when they were gasping for breath, seemed to make a crackling sound, as it was described, much like taking a piece of bubble wrap in your hands and crunching the bubbles. Now, in the absence of official information, or when things happen so fast and the devastation around you so rapid that you're not sure where to turn or even how to turn to get authoritative information, people come up with their own remedies for things. And here's an example of the kinds of remedies that people were circulating. Some parent might say, oh, this worked for me, and tell a neighbor, and the neighbor says, well, all right, I'll try that too. I suppose my favorite is the red pepper sandwiches. I can vouch for the efficacy of red pepper sandwiches in a way, because our Spit Spreads Death exhibit debuted in October, and at the opening reception, we served red pepper sandwiches. And to my knowledge, to this day, not a single person who ate a red pepper sandwich that night has come down with the flu. Now here we have an image of nurses, and you see they're wearing gauze masks. And just as we are now required in some cases to wear masks when in public places, this is a natural thing that people realized might be efficacious in 1918. Now, the sad part is it's probably not effective against the virus at all. The virus is so small, it can go right through that, but it might keep some secondary infections at bay. And also, people's sputum could be contained within that, and it could also catch the sputum of somebody else. Public health posters were going up all over the place to get people to do these things. And at the time, it was a combination of scary posters such as Spit Spreads Death, and also ones with little jingles that you could remember to advise yourself when you needed to, I need to do this. I think my favorite was a Red Cross poster to get people to wear masks. And it said something like this: obey the laws and wear the gauze. Protect your claws from septic paws. So that's the kind of thing. But I call your attention to the banner on the American flag in the back. It says, if I fail, he dies. The image that you can't quite see here is an American nurse with a wounded or ill American soldier. And this is the stark message that people were getting. The work that you're doing to preserve health is, in fact, life or death. If I fail as a nurse, that soldier will die. Well, you probably haven't forgotten about the fund drive, but even with all that mortality going on, people are still opening their pockets, and the fund drive ends. And believe it or not, even with this disaster, Philadelphians not only met the fundraising goal, but they exceeded it. Now, the Philadelphia Council of National Defense is worth highlighting here, because there's a point at which people began to extemporize, try things, band together, find ways to cope, just as we see people doing now with coronavirus. The Philadelphia Council was a citizens volunteer council that was appointed to oversee all these war industries going on in Philadelphia. What they were to oversee was working conditions, make sure the people over there doing this thing are getting paid the same as the people over there who are doing the same thing. Make sure working hours are reasonable. And this council decided, wait a minute, we are people of influence on this council. We've got this epidemic going on. Maybe we should band together and do something. So Cruzen cements his efforts with that of the volunteer group. And this group sets up a temporary headquarters in a department store. They advertise a phone number, a one-shot phone number, if you need any service at all that deals with anything to do with the flu pandemic or epidemic as at the time. And if you wanted a doctor or nurse, you would call. And somebody at that other end would perhaps send somebody out, not a doctor or nurse, simply to reconnoiter, assess the situation, come back, determine what's really required here, and send somebody out. The city was divided up into districts, doctors and nurses and other supplies apportioned by those districts, and people began volunteering in big ways and hazarding their health. Ambulances is a good example. People were volunteering their private vehicles to be emergency vehicles or to do other necessary flu-related work. They would sport green flags on these cars to signify this is what they were doing and they should have the right of way. So if there is an heroic story to come out of this, it's citizens volunteering, abstracting new ways of doing things in conjunction with a public health director who has some resources and know-how. The photograph you see here is a 1920s family photograph from the Conway family. This is an Irish immigrant family in Philadelphia. And to descendants today, this family photo means a variety of things. You've got twin boys, you've got a newborn and a young girl here. But to the family today, this photograph also has another meaning, and it's a sad one. It's because of the child who isn't there, Elizabeth Conway. In 1918, this family was managing its affairs, but the flu hits the household. And the youngest daughter at the time, Elizabeth, who's 3 years old, gets the flu. Now, Elizabeth didn't have much time in life to establish her own mark on the world, but the family particularly enjoyed her fascination with dolls and holding doll tea parties involving family members. But she dies of the flu. And this family, like many other families suffering death in Philadelphia, simply had to pick up pieces and get on. The father himself, Patrick Conway, was down with the flu, but he's still going to work. So he has to labor with the disease to get money to feed a family. At the same time, he has a dying daughter. The daughter dies. He is forced to take the daughter and bury the daughter himself. But afterwards, when the flu goes away and families begin to come back to grips with whatever normal living is going to look like again, what's the aftermath of this? It's a family tragedy. It's a private tragedy. There was never any public funeral. There was never any public memorialization. So the family remembers that the father, for many years throughout the rest of his life, would occasionally absent himself from family affairs, go down to the basement, pull out Elizabeth's dolls and the tea party, and sit and think and remember privately by himself, and then eventually return to family business. And many such scenes were probably enacted throughout Philadelphia. But in November, things began to change. Now, it is possible that Philadelphia experienced multiple waves of the flu. Those early cases in September, the Navy Yard, where mortality was not particularly high, the morbidity or sick rate was fairly high, but it started to even off, even into early October when the mortality part started to spike. It's possible that there was an earlier, milder form of the flu, since flu is a highly versatile germ and there are many variants. And there may have been a second wave that kicked in that killed people very rapidly and in great numbers. And over a 6-week period, one person in Philadelphia dies every 5 minutes, approximately 13,000 people in all. But even though there's a decline in November, just in time for an armistice to end the war, people start reopening again. The governor of the state, who had issued a closure order, gives another order to reopen gradually. But a third bump seems to happen, not with the severe high mortality rate that we saw, but it elevates the weekly death rate significantly for a few months. And it's not really until March of 1919 that things really seem to settle down to quote unquote normal conditions. Now, Gene Shinnick is another Philadelphian who lived to ripe old age and was remembered by her family as a little bit of a humorous person for being an excessive worrier. She lived through the Depression. She lived through the flu. Her father had committed suicide, lived through World War II. So she had plenty of anxiety in the world to incorporate in her life experience. And she was remembered for hurrying out to the pond next to the house every time the water level seemed to drop. And she would come back and say, I think there's an environmental catastrophe, head for the hills. And the family would kind of laugh it off. But once and once only, she revealed a memory from 1918. And she was a child at the time and had been sick. And while recovering, she got up and walked out on the front porch of the suburban home. And she was interested to see there were neighbors that she knew very well, of course, across the street. Why were they all lying down asleep in front of the house? She looked up and down the street and she saw more people on sidewalks and in front lawns. And then she realized they're not sleeping. They're all corpses. Perhaps it was Frank Bieberstein himself who was going to come up with his cart and partner any moment now to take the bodies away. So memories like this tended to be buried in family experiences and just not talked about. So what had just happened here? This swept through the country. Approximately 1 in every 4 Americans gets sick with the flu, and that's probably roughly true for Philadelphia particularly. And as I said, over the 6 weeks, we had this particularly skyrocketing death count. What made this unusual is we keep hearing that the very young and the very old are always most susceptible to disease outbreaks, particularly these upper respiratory viruses that keep coming and going. The flu, of course, is being one that we keep experiencing year to year to year. But interestingly, young adults seem particularly hard hit, and the mortality among young adults was very, very high. So if you're looking at a graph, you get a high point for some very young, you get a high point for very old whose bodies are weakened with just the circumstances of age, and then this healthy young adult surge that to this date no one can definitively explain. When we look back to the American Civil War of the 1860s, we had 1 soldier dying in combat for every 2 soldiers dying due to disease. That had flipped around by the time of the Spanish-American War and World War I and to World War II, except that World War I pushed back in the Civil War direction. Every war since, we've had far more soldiers die in combat to die of disease. But World War I, 55% of our war deaths were actually disease. And the reason was the flu. Most of our soldiers who died of disease died of the flu. This is President Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States at the time. You saw him in the picture of the parade. During the course of this epidemic in the country, while we were also trying to raise money for the war and focusing on supporting the troops, President Wilson never made a single public utterance about the flu. There were no federal agencies dealing with emergency responses to localities as we have them now. There was no FEMA. No federal agencies came to the assistance of localities like Philadelphia during the run of the pandemic. So people would look to local government, particularly for the leadership, and state government, because the federal government's emphasis was somewhere else. So historians cite Wilson for a lack of leadership on this, but it also affects the war conclusion in that Wilson himself became very sick. Some key members of his staff actually caught the flu and died, and the Paris negotiations at Versailles were certainly affected by the flu cases that continued to happen into 1919. And there are historians who believe that some of the agreements made that set the world pattern for the next several decades happened as a result of the flu. So in a way, it was sort of a hit and run thing because we started to go back to business. We didn't change our way of doing business. Industries came back to doing what they had to do. Hospitals continued to run under the same model. There was one long-term effect that didn't really happen at this time, but the flu created the circumstances and new thinking into the 1920s and 30s. We don't know the exact numbers of flu dead in 1918, 1919, because there was no common reporting structure. But in the 1920s and 1930s in the United States, we moved to a national reporting structure for medical statistics and also conducted the first ever survey of the health of Americans in the 1930s. Orphans need to be identified here because parents got sick and died and left children. And we had a severe orphan problem in Philadelphia. And while the pandemic was running, people were simply told, hey, if you see a kid wandering around without parents, just take him in, do what you can do. After the whole flu thing passed, then people could start to go through the legal machinery and deal with orphans. But there's significant records, if you look for them, in various Philadelphia institutions. Girard College is a good example, which has an interesting record of the orphan surge at that institution owing to the flu. Now, this is a statement by an historian about the flu sculpting human populations. And remember what I said at the outset, just as diseases can sculpt populations, populations can also sculpt the contours of disease. The war and the political circumstances attendant to the war certainly shaped how the disease was understood, how people responded to it. But there was a scientific story behind this. They did not know the exact nature of the flu virus in 1918. They also did not know how to stop it, how to prevent it in a definitive way. And there was a frantic search for a vaccine. And while the pandemic was playing out, a couple of vaccines came out in a short term. They were guesswork vaccines, and they had no effect on the flu. And It took a while. The flu virus itself was not actually identified to the 1930s, and the first effective vaccine not licensed to the end of World War II. So that took decades afterwards. It's also a reminder that with all our talk now about coronavirus, we'll have a vaccine in a year. There is absolutely no certainty that there will be a coronavirus vaccine. There are major diseases that come and go on this planet. HIV is a good example, which has no vaccine. One has not yet been developed. But the one social change that begins to happen is public health care. I mentioned national reporting, National Health Survey. We also see employers beginning to set up and run employer-provided health insurance policies. The Soviet Union, which was a relatively young nation at this time, was actually a leader in creating a mass socialized medicine, including assigning doctors the role of being epidemiologists, being ones who have to peer into sociological conditions, try to get at the true circumstances of how diseases multiply, how they set in neighborhoods, how they set in cities, and what we need to do to combat them. So they were setting a model. It wasn't until recently, though, recovering a body of a flu victim who had been buried in permafrost, that we could identify absolutely the flu variant that killed so many people in 1918. It's H1N1, the H and the N both referring to these proteins. Now, the H1N1 means that there's a lot of them. There's, I think, up to 18 H's and, I don't know, 9 or 10 N's. So in combination, you get a lot of mutability with this flu virus. To this day, there is no definitive explanation for why H1N1 was such a killer in 1918. But remember that we've had subsequent flu pandemics. We've seen this kind of literature in the last few years. There's no excuse for our political environment for ignorance, because the scientific environment's been on top of this. Time magazine cover stories you see here from a few years ago. Science magazine, a technical scientific journal, talking about emerging infectious diseases. Now remember, the flu cases don't get a lot of publicity in this country. And you see here the annual figure of flu deaths. And we seem to go about our business, maybe get a flu shot. I hope we get flu shots and hope for the best. The flu shot every year is aimed at the flu variant that is deemed to be the most likely adversary during flu season. And if you get a flu shot this past winter season, it would have been aimed at H1N1, genetically the descendant of the H1N1 that killed so many in 1918. Remember, we've had a 1957 flu pandemic, 1968 one, and then the 2009 swine flu. We didn't have to go into the world lockdown that we see today, but think about this. In 2017, 2018, that flu season, the CDC recorded 79,000 flu deaths in the United States, 79,000. Now, we just recently surpassed that number with coronavirus, but if we go into the fall and the flu rears its ugly head in this very bad way, we're going to be back with intensive home quarantine. It's impossible to talk about the flu anymore these days, as we on the Spit Spreads Death Team have been discovering. The press has been reaching out to us a lot for talk about comparing now with 1918 and the lessons learned. Unfortunately, as you see here with the Chinese customers not welcome, the racism and cultural prejudice simply cannot be eliminated. It is simply happening. And of course, we're seeing protests to reopen. We're seeing doctors and nurses challenged. We see police officers being challenged who are trying to police the social distancing. A lot of Americans are getting sick and tired of this after almost 2 months, and we're going to have to put up with this for a bit longer. This was all predicted. We have had this in the literature, scientific and mainstream literature, for quite some time, and it's always very difficult for politicians to put aside resources for something that is not right in front of them at the moment. This is a word that I cannot pronounce. The word means forgetting. And I'd like to turn your attention to how we remember these events, how we remember big disease sweeps through human populations. The Alaskan Native peoples experienced the highest death count of any part of the United States in 1918. In a good hunk of Alaska, about 40% of Native peoples died of the flu. Whole villages were deserted as a result. Well, this particular group of people, the Yupik people, used this word to denote forgetting. They decided to simply blot this out of memory. It was an event of such horrific magnitude that they wanted to simply put it aside, not talk about it, not communicate this experience to a next generation of Yupik people. That's one decision about how to deal with it. So how do we remember this? Well, disease comes, disease goes. It's not like a Civil War battle where you have generals and heroic actions and a statue put up and maybe a battlefield preserved. What you get are people like the Gene Skinnick family or the Conway family, people who are simply individually devastated, and collectively this counts as a big disaster. But remember, the quest went on to pursue the flu in a scientific and medical way, and the scientific language kept changing, particularly as we learned about DNA and RNA in the 1950s. But it was not actually a forgotten epidemic, even though it was referred to that way. There continued to be a substantial literature on this. But what you have, unfortunately, for a museum person like me, is very little material evidence that this had happened. Institutions continue to work as they did before. The war effort is, in the history books, the prevailing narrative. The flu is sort of a subset story of that. So we haven't had any moment in American history where we could sort of collate or share a collective narrative about this event. We have the personal narratives, the multiple personal narratives, which mostly are embedded within private family stories. In fiction, we do have some big moments of this. Catherine Ann Porter, successful novelist, originally a reporter, wrote this novella, which is still in print, and I recommend it. It's a novella that actually fictionalizes her own experience. She was young, in her early 20s. She was a reporter. She had an Army lieutenant for a lover. Both of them got the flu. And she went through those severe steps downward into the hallucinations, the sensory deprivation. And her newspaper thought she was going to die and prepared her obituary, but she recovered. She pulled out of it. Remember, she was in her young, early 20s. When she came out of it, her hair had completely turned white, as you see in this photograph of her taken when she was just in her early 40s in this painting. And all of those symptoms, if you want to get into the mind of somebody articulate who can describe what it was like to live at this time, what was the social atmosphere, everything from the World War I pressure to experiencing the 4 Minutemen and then getting this disease, I recommend this work. So what have we done here at the Mütter Museum? We've created this long-term exhibition, and one day you will be able to come back and see it. This was a major thing for us. It's the most expensive project we've ever undertaken. The exhibit, which will be up for about 5 years, is perhaps the most prominent feature of this. But there were other features to this, including a health fair that we conducted in a neighborhood that in 1918 had been hard hit and is now primarily a neighborhood of immigrants. So we worked this out with a broad spectrum of people. We had 2 co-curators, one a history curator, one an art curator, plus our own internal team. And to do something of this magnitude, we had to get major support. And we were fortunate to get support multiple times and from some of these in order to carry forth with this project. It was very much a public planning process because one key feature is we brought artists in. The artists were tasked not simply to create some work of art to illustrate the big bad flu, but to create a work that speaks to the flu pandemic in some substantial way in its own right. As I said, there was little material evidence, but we wanted to look for some things to put in this exhibit. We discovered, for example, that, of course, the Mütter Museum collection has nursing equipment used in 1918, but it's the same equipment that would have been used in 1917 or 1925. But the Catholic Archdiocese, as I mentioned earlier, it seems to have a substantial inventory of flu-related archives, particularly photographs, as you saw with the mass graves. Bryn Mawr College has its own experience, and in their own archive, we found that the college actually quarantined itself from the outside world, and students within, everybody else outside. And they happen to have some very interesting correspondence between student talking about the experience of living and going to school at Bryn Mawr, but also dealing with the flu and not being able to go outside the perimeter. But I think my favorite artifact that we discovered came from Drexel University, which has a costume collection. A young Philadelphia woman named Naomi Ford went out shopping to buy very high-end fashion items for her women friends. She wanted to do some early Christmas shopping, and she bought gift boxes, wrote out tags, sometimes little poems on these tags, and set them away. Unfortunately, Naomi Ford caught the flu and she died. She did not live to see Christmas. Her family had taken all her belongings, stuck them away in the attic where those undelivered Christmas presents resided for a very long time until they ended up in the costume collection at Drexel. So this handbag is currently on exhibit, and people have a hard time digesting big numbers of people who died, people who got sick. But to see an undelivered Christmas present that speaks to that moment, that cultural moment in the fashion world, but also the handwritten label in the gift box, can really give a kick in the gut. And that's exactly the experience we want. We also made huge use of the death certificates. These are mini biographies in their own right. And you see here, you've got a woman on the left, Eliza Boney, African-American woman. She's a housekeeper and she dies. She's fairly young, and some death certificates speak to the immigrants because background of family history is there. Most of these cases will either give cause of death as influenza or pneumonia with influenza as the contributing cause. And there are approximately 20,000 of these over a course of time, which have all been put online by the city, and they have been a significant archive. We decided in this exhibit to go relatively artifact light and instead provide you with information. So we distilled, if that's the word for it, a lot of data from those death certificates into a database. And we put a lot of stock in a couple of interactives that allow you to explore neighborhoods. You can find out if somebody died in your own home in 1918, for example, or see how the flu cases progressed through your own neighborhood or through the city. If you're a school teacher, you might want to interrogate the system to find out, did school teachers die? Who were they? How many of them were there? So this is something you can explore on your own when you come visit. The artists decided to recreate the Liberty Loan Parade, not the full 200,000 people in 6-mile-long route, but far more limited. And it was set up and run in a very particular way. The people you see in the photograph who are participating in the parade are all carrying signs representing people who died on October 12th, 1918, the highest mortality day. And these people, in many cases, are descendants of the people that they're representing. The flip side of those placards has the death certificate of that person. So people were marching into this parade, which was shaped by these light floats that you see this woman in the upper right surrounded by. And this was photographed from the ground and from the air. And there's a 13-minute loop of this film with the music that was composed for the parade. That's a very intense and moving experience. And when you come to the exhibit, I hope you'll take the time to look at it. The unusual outcome of all this is that people with these family stories have been contacting us and thanking us for an opportunity to promote an understanding of this event and what happened to the family. People are contributing family stories to us, and scores of stories have come to date. And if any of you have a family flu story, we would definitely like to hear from you, because we're planning to create a digital scrapbook online for these stories in coming months. Some of them range from the comical to the grotesque and belief-challenging experiences of some families. Now, before we open it to questions, that you saw that photograph of this nurse at the outset. I said we'd come back to that little button that was on her collar. This is the button that she's actually wearing. You recognize it? It's an honor button for having given to the 4th Liberty Loan Parade. So we can identify exactly when this picture was taken because it was at the time of that parade, and she's wearing an honor button, so she won't be called a slacker. I think it's time to open it for questions if anybody has any. Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank our staff making this happen, Mike Von Helder doing the technical stuff, Julia Lemire, who's organizing the thing in its totality.
So some questions have been trickling in, so we'll start with those, but feel free to post some others and we'll try to get to as many as possible. So for one that first came in, there was a slide with the grave diggers that reminds them of New York City and what's happening recently. And they just had a question about why are bodies in refrigerated trucks and is this sanitary?
The only answer I can give you is just what I'm getting from keeping close track of some of the news. The bodies are outstripping the ability of autopsies to be conducted under, of course, conditions which protect all the health workers, and then they have to be buried. I guess there must be some protocols in effect in New York for how that's to be done with families. Families obviously want to have something to do with burying their own dead. I can't comment further because I'm not privy to all the details in New York. As far as the sanitary part of this, refrigerator trucks, of course, keep bodies from piling up outside a city morgue on a warm day, which is what happened in 1918 Philadelphia, which created a big public health hazard. So refrigerated trucks is certainly a temporary solution, and I'm sure that's all they're intended for in New York. The bodies are just multiplying so rapidly, it outstrips the ability of people there to just deal with them one by one by one. I think that's the best answer I could give, but I'd like to offer a statement about New York. New York obviously has been getting a lot of publicity for the concentration of how coronavirus has hit. But people are frequently asking when I and my colleagues do interviews about 1918 flu, what lessons we can learn. Well, I'm not sure there are big lessons from 1918 that either we're not experiencing now and learning lessons again, or seeing the necessity of measures we're seeing the necessity of. But New York does have one object lesson for us, and it's not from the flu. It's from 1866. If you were living in a big city in the young United States, and on the East Coast, Washington, well, Washington, maybe not much of a city, but Philly, Boston, Charleston, you worried about the common diseases that would come with seasons, like yellow fever. Smallpox was always a problem. And if you were living in an era when the disease-causing mechanisms are not well understood, you just worried about it or tried something to keep yourself at a distance. New York created a public health board in advance of what they thought was going to be a big cholera outbreak. Cholera thrives in areas where there's bad sanitation, where water that's tainted with fecal matter can get into you, and you have a big problem. And we continue to see cholera outbreaks, not in the United States today, but in other places where the bad sanitation conditions exist, particularly in the aftermath of a big disaster. New York decided to take an advanced step on this and organize a public health board. And they put a cross-section of people on it. Obviously, there were political people. There had to be medical people. And this is at a time when germ theory, as we understand it, was not part of the medical world. And also citizens. I remember there was one citizen who was challenged for being on this because he was a plumber. As he pointed out, that the business of a health board is going to be to clean up cesspools, to run good sanitation. And who's actually going to make that happen? A plumber. So the health board made a lot of decisions in anticipation of a cholera outbreak. They had cholera before. Philadelphia had experienced some bad cholera moments in the 1840s, for example. And they put these measures into place, which cleaned up the city. And when the cholera came, it turned out to be a minimal problem. And they had proven to themselves that if you can align the political, the scientific, and the popular pieces, you can have a common concerted effort that actually works. That was not the case in 1918, when the political authorities on the federal level were all diverted to the war effort and not the flu. Today, you certainly do not have an alliance of popular sentiment in line with science, in line with the political leadership. If you don't have those three in alignment, you are not going to get through things very quickly. My little statement.
Thank you. So there were a couple other questions in regards to the mass grave, that the location of it. So is that something that you know where it is?
I can give you, let's see, looking at some notes of mine. Mass graves were placed in a couple of places. Let's see if I've got those written down. I do, 3 of them. 2 Catholic cemeteries, Holy Cross, Holy Sepulchre, and also at 2nd and Lucerne. That's where the city had its big potter's field. So bodies were primarily placed in those 3 locations, except for those people who ended up just going out and burying them themselves or leaving bodies at other cemeteries. Many of those bodies were later exhumed and placed in other cemeteries. If you walk around some of the large cemeteries in town, Laurel Hill, West Laurel Hill, you can see sometimes specific dates on tombstones that are giveaways that these people died of the flu.
Thank you so much. We just had one person mention they saw this exhibit before all the closures. Well done. The question is, what was the biggest challenge in putting together the exhibit that you were not expecting?
The biggest challenge that we were not expecting. I don't know if this is a challenge, but the biggest unforeseen outcome was the spontaneous coming forth of people with family stories. That completely overwhelmed us. We didn't know we were going to get that. I don't know that we had a particular challenge, since we had worked through several years of taking very discrete steps with outside funding to go through a public process of determining what people are likely to want to know, what's the best way we could tell these stories, and what might we show in the way of artifacts, and how might we go about some kind of interactive experience, something we don't ordinarily do at the Mutter. In a way, those are all challenges because, of course, we didn't know how we were going to do any of this when we started. But it took a few grants, focus groups. We did surveys with people coming through the museum to say, what do you know about the flu? What do you want to know about the flu? What do you think happened in Philadelphia? To help guide us on these questions. So the challenge was simply meeting deadlines, all this. With outside funding, you've got to meet deadlines. I think there was another piece to the question, but I can't think what it is at the moment. Was there?
I think you managed that question very well. So are you ready for the next one?
I am.
Okay, great. Let's see. Robert, thank you for this talk. With the Great Migration in its first wave during the World War I years, do you know if Black Philadelphians were more, less, or about the same affected by the epidemic?
That is a really excellent question. To the best of my knowledge, and I'm trying to get a hold of some information at the moment that might actually change that view. We believe that African Americans pretty much suffered as their white counterparts. There's some evidence that the flu did not achieve the same mortality rate in an overall count in African American communities than it did in white. Do not know why that might be. It would make sense that it's at least the same, and that seems to be our best evidence. Have heard from one physician that city hospitals would not take African American patients during the flu pandemic. I'm not quite sure where that assertion comes from. Having gone back to some primary records, I can find records of nurses that point out that they were treating both Black and white in hospitals. Certainly the Philadelphia General Hospital, or Blockley Hospital, was the big charity hospital of Philadelphia. And we know that there were Black patients being seen there, but I don't know if other hospitals, in fact, turn Black Americans away. But it's interesting that among the newspapers, where we, of course, get some of our data, because of the censorship and the desire not to publish articles that appeared critical of the government, you didn't see much about the flu in anybody's reporting except to monitor the cases or give specific anecdotes of, society matron, Mrs. So-and-so just died of the flu and here's her biography. But the African American press was very conservative about this. And the African American press was experiencing a big dilemma because there, of course, were Black soldiers in France at the moment in segregated outfits. And the African American community was fighting the same image problem they had fought before, even in the Civil War, when the first occasion arose for Black troops to be employed in combat, which was, we still have to show the world that Black soldiers can fight. They're the equal of anybody else on the battlefield. They have resilience, courage, stamina, and so on. So the Black newspapers had to be a little bit extra patriotic in showing, hey, we're out there with you, we're supporting the country. And there might have been a reluctance to report on flu cases because that might seem to detract from that. So it's difficult to get a lot of good information that looks broadly at African American experience. There are family stories, as I relayed some in white families, and I'm just learning some family stories among Black families at the moment, which I can incorporate later. That's a long-winded answer, but it's still a good question because it still is worth prying into. There is no published work, scholarly or popular, on the Philadelphia 1918 flu epidemic. There isn't any. And some of the popular books that deal with this problem, look at the flu internationally or nationally, sometimes have brief descriptions of what happened in Philadelphia that are not always reliable. So it's a long-winded answer to say, we still need to know more. Our best guess at the moment is likely equal experience in mortality and morbidity as white communities.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, if that's all right with you.
Sure.
Great. So I know your focus is medical history, but I'm curious about the economic fallout of 1918-19 epidemic in comparison to our current situation. Do you have any extra information about that?
I just have a little, but remember in 1918, the main impact was on public gatherings for entertainments, theater, concerts. Schools got closed for a time and then gradually reopened in November. So the length of time that we've spent on home quarantine exceeds the time most cities spent in 1918. One problem with that is San Francisco was a good example in 1918. They started to lift their various requirements, and that may have been a city where it was mandated by law to wear a gauze mask in public. Philadelphia didn't go quite that far. But Philadelphia started to open, or San Francisco began to reopen, and then another wave of the flu came through. And then they had to rein people back in again, and were sorry that they had opened up in the first place. So you have that dilemma now as they had in 1918. But remember, people were not closing small businesses. The orders from the governor were public gatherings, public spaces to be vacated. So people were still going to work. People were still running their shops. They needed money to live. Of course, that's true now, but there were no fallback measures. And it wasn't until that volunteer effort began to kick in that, say, food kitchens, impromptu soup kitchens began to show up in disadvantaged neighborhoods or poverty-stricken neighborhoods to help keep people fed when they may not have been too healthy enough to even make it to work. So you didn't have any federal effort or state effort to come up with subventions for keeping small businesses afloat, because that problem effectively didn't exist in 1918. Where you did have a problem in Philadelphia was, for example, public transportation, which the use of public transportation dropped immensely. And the business people connected with that did raise issues about it and want to sum up, here's what happened to us, here's all the money we lost. Some other businesses in Philly that couldn't operate, very few of them, occasionally step forward. I can't remember any particular ones at the moment, but remember, by the mass, everybody was still working. So the economic comparison is pretty lopsided between 1918 and what we're having to do right now.
Thank you so much. And is there anything else that you would like to say before we sign off today?
Yes. If you can put my mug, this is Charlotte, my plague doctor. So it's a reminder, wear that mask.
Thank you so much, Robert. Have a good day, everyone.
All right. Thank you all for attending. Julia, Mike, thank you very much.
Thank you.